Last summer, after a lifetime as a New Yorker, I traded in my Empire State driver's license for one from the land of Lincoln, as I was honored to be selected as the new senior rabbi of Chicago Sinai congregation. I'm still learning the fastest way between home and O'Hare, testing the virtues of Paisanos versus Malnati's pizza, and trying to figure out as a Yankee fan whether to masquerade as a Cubs or a White Sox fan. But the one thing that has been, thank you, yes, people do care about them. The one thing that has been clear to me from the first day in Chicago is that my new home is blessed to have some of the most inspired and inspiring congressional representatives, including Representative Jan Schakowsky. Since her first foray on the public stage as an early consumer advocate, to the 8 years she has spent in the State General Assembly, to her 9 terms in Congress, Representative Schakowsky has made championing the rights and well-being of all people her cause. She has tackled the real and growing problem of income inequality and was appointed by then Speaker Pelosi to the National Commission on Fiscal Responsibility and Reform, where she bucked the majority and offered her own proposal to balance the budget without cutting Social Security, Medicare, or Medicaid. She co-chairs the Democratic Seniors Task Force, which focuses on addressing the needs of older Americans. She is the lead sponsor of the remarkable International Violence Against Women Act, which aims to make ending gender-based violence a foreign policy priority. And I agree. And she has been a strong voice of friendship and support for advancing the two-state solution. For all these reasons and many more, it is my pleasure to present our next speaker, Representative Jan Schakowsky.
Rabbi, welcome to Chicago. And you can't be both, so you have to pick Cubs or White Sox. Chicago, it's impossible. It really is an honor to be here. I want to thank the Religious Action Center for all of your work on this wide array of social justice issues that you're hearing about today. You've been an inspiration to me. It's a pleasure now to, after years of working with David Saperstein now, to work with Jonah Pesner. And really, thank you for all of your partnership on the issues that we've been talking about. When you clap for me, you're really clapping for yourselves, because those are the things that you do. So thank you. So I was born and raised in Rogers Park in Chicago. My father sold furniture. My mother was a teacher in the Chicago Public Schools for decades and a proud member of the Chicago Teachers Union. My first 7 years were in an apartment in West Rogers Park, and then my parents were able to buy a small 3-bedroom house right near Rogers School and a short ride away from Sullivan High School, where I graduated public schools. And we were far from rich, but I never remember my parents worrying about money. In retirement, they were able to do some traveling, thanks in large part to my mother's teacher's pension, which also assured that my father's income had some income after she died. I think when he left the furniture business, he got a gold watch. Every Sunday, we would drive down Western Avenue to visit my grandparents in Humboldt Park in Chicago. And a couple of weeks ago, I actually went by that house, and the house was still standing. The neighborhood looked pretty good, mostly Hispanic. But I was most interested in the garage, which was my favorite place because at the time, I was a little girl. It was the barn and the home of Teddy the horse. And every morning before dawn, Teddy would pull my grandfather in the wagon to the Central Market in Chicago, where he'd pick up heavy bags of potatoes and other vegetables. And he would, Teddy and my grandpa would go through the alleys of Humboldt Park, and he would schlep those heavy bags up the back stairs. And that's what he did for a living, and all 4 of his children went to college. That is a story about an immigrant experience that was actually pretty typical. On those Sundays, my grandparents and my parents would be in the kitchen gossiping in Yiddish. My grandparents were born in Russia, except my mother, who was born on the way over in Montreal, before they made their way, with the help of the Salvation Army, to Chicago. So all of the children, including my mother, did better than they did in terms of their opportunities and their income, but that was really expected. It wasn't unusual. No one remarked about that. Oh my, a peddler and his children went to college. We actually had a small cottage in Michigan City, Indiana, which is on Lake Michigan, built in part with my dad's own hands and shared with my aunt and uncle. But it's also true that even the men, the families who worked in the mills on the south side of Chicago in the 50s and 60s and 70s, they could afford a cabin too, where wife and kids would go for the summer and dad would come after work. Most of those cabins are torn down now, replaced by pretty fancy houses of much wealthier people. So we weren't rich, but we weren't worried. And how different that is from today. Whereas Richard Trumka, who is the president of the AFL-CIO, described it as most people come home now to a full plate of worry. Elizabeth Warren tells about her childhood where a family of 3 actually made it, believe it or not, on the minimum wage. And the real buying power of the minimum wage right now is about the same as it was in 1966. But I'm really not here to reminisce, although I like to do it, about the old days. Many may describe my childhood as so 20th century, so yesterday, so gone, and so gone forever. But I want to tell a different story with a happy ending, that economic security for everyday Americans not only is possible, but unless we achieve it, all of us are in deep trouble. So here's the most important data point that I want to make. I just made to some students on the Capitol steps. The United States has never been richer than it is today, and we are the richest country in the history of humankind. Between 1979 and 2014, the per capita gross domestic product grew 77%, and productivity rose 75%. But over the last decades, the wages of the bottom 80% of Americans has fallen or stagnated, actually gone down despite these increases. But since the Great Recession of 2008, the richest 1% of Americans has seen 95% of the benefits from growth. So according to Larry Summers, he was the former Treasury Secretary, if the U.S. had the same income distribution it had in 1979, the bottom 89% of Americans would have $1 trillion more in income, $11,000 more a family. 8 Americans made at least $10 billion in 2013. One family, one American. $10 billion is as much as almost 200,000 Americans earn in a year combined. The vast majority of those 8 fortunes were realized not as a result of work, as most of us understand it, but the old-fashioned way, inheritance, stock market, and other investments. And it's still true today that the best way to earn a fortune in America is to already have one. And speaking of inheritance, last Thursday, the Republican majority in the House voted to eliminate the estate tax altogether. Understand, you can already pass on those of you who are gleeful over that, I just want you to know that you can already pass on to your children $5.4 million per individual or $10.8 million as a couple that won't be taxed for an inheritance tax. But now they wanted to do more for 5,500 estates. That's it, by scrapping any tax. So doing that will cost the Treasury about $259 billion over 10 years. So remember, this is money we're talking about that's passed on to the likes of Paris Hilton and her very bratty brother that you may have heard about, how he caused a fuss on an airline, said his father could buy the airlines and everyone here is just a peasant. That was a word he used. Anyway, so this tax cut is part of a $1 trillion tax cut, almost all for the wealthiest over the next 10 years, unpaid for, adding to the debt, which supposedly, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are so worried about debt. And yet, with all this wealth, we are forced into this frame of scarcity, that we can't afford to do any of the things that we really need to do. And we're told, for example, that we can't increase nutrition spending for the 1 in 5 American children who are food insecure. It is a shanda. It is an embarrassment that is the number of children who food insecure is really a euphemism for hungry, unless we cut something else in order to pay for it. Otherwise, it would be so irresponsible of us, of course, leaving our children with this large debt that they're going to have to manage. And yet ending the estate tax altogether is unpaid for. So, of course, we didn't, even by paying for it, increase nutrition at all. I don't know what I'm saying, because the Republican passed budget cuts that cuts the SNAP program, we used to call it food stamps, by $125 billion. I stood on the floor of the House of Representatives, and I looked at them, and I said, did you really come to Congress to take food out of the mouths of hungry children? Who are you? I said, every religion in the world says that we are to feed the hungry. So it is part of the plan that American children, our children, go hungry in order to help the Walton's kids who own Walmart. That's just a fact. 26 profitable Fortune 500 companies paid no taxes at all from 2008 to 2013, Verizon and GE among them, and they got refunds that I promise are bigger than any of you got, combined and multiplied by many times. $2.9 billion, a refund for GE, an effective tax rate of -9%, and only $732 million refund for Verizon on its $42 billion in U.S. profits. So I could go on, and so I will for just a minute. Yeah. So we have a new governor in Illinois, Governor Bruce Rauner, who there was a short time that the income tax, which is flat in Illinois, was raised from 3.5% to 5% so that we could afford to fund a few things that we need, like health care and education. But Bruce Rauner reduced it back to the 3.5%, so 1.5% reduction. Guess how much he saved from that? $750,000 was his tax savings from that reduction. Now he wants to cut Medicaid, and this is typical around the country. $1.4 billion, eliminate adult dental and foot care and breast and cervical cancer programs, 30% from higher education, and that's what you do with a turnaround company where only the bottom line matters, and that's what we're seeing in our home state now of Illinois. Americans simply can't afford to retire. The National Institute on Retirement Security put out a chilling report recently. 4 out of 5 households have less than 1 year's income in retirement savings. But in fact, it's really much worse than that. The average working age household has only $2,500 in retirement savings, while people who are nearer to retirement have a whopping $12,000 saved for retirement. So in this richest country, at the richest moment in the history, government does operate in this framework of scarcity when it comes to investments that help ordinary people. We can't even agree on a long-term transportation bill to fund roads and bridges and mass transit and all the jobs that they create, much less fix the huge number of schools that are crumbling around us. In Washington, both the House and Senate Republican budget, they passed cuts in investments in healthcare, education, and other domestic priorities by almost 40%, the lowest level seen in 50 years. So when they say we have to quit all this spending, as a percentage, this is the lowest point that we've been in 50 years. And the problem is that this is really bad, even if you don't care about ordinary, everyday people. This is really bad for our economy. Working families, okay. I'm going to explain that. Working families spend about 90% of their income on consumption. They buy stuff. And the rich spent less than 45%. In 2012 alone, an estimated $1.3 trillion was sucked out of the economy because it was sitting in bank accounts of the richest Americans instead of being spent. And if that money went to people who would spend it, it's estimated that it would create 10 million jobs. We would have full employment in the United States. So I'm trying to stick to economics and not necessarily morality, but I know that you're interested in that too. What's good for the American economy and not about right and wrong, but I can't because I want to tell you what Congressman Tom Price, he's chairman of the Budget Committee, and he said in justifying a budget that makes the worst income inequality since 1929 even worse. So this is what Tom Price said on the floor of the House. This is in the congressional record. I was there. He said, many of our friends here on this floor have asked about budgets being moral documents, and they are. Let me ask, Madam Chair, where is the morality in trapping disadvantaged people in a web of welfare programs that discourage self-sufficiency and instead shackle them to government dependency? Where is the morality, Madam Chair, in committing retirees to a health coverage program that is going bankrupt? Not true. That is going bankrupt and that can't keep its promises if its so-called protectors keep blocking reform? Where is the morality, Madam Chair, in forcing low-income people into second-rate health programs in which many can't get appointments and in which doctors are grossly under-reimbursed by the government? Where is the morality, Madam Chair, in tying college students to years of crippling debt because of a government-run loan program that drives up tuitions? Where is the morality in heaping trillions of dollars of debt onto future generations to finance today's government spending because today's policymakers refuse to stop overspending? So if you agree with this definition of morality, which I expect you don't, you haven't been spending much time reading the Bible or the scriptures of any religion. But you also don't understand the facts about the success of Medicare and Medicaid, or who really contributes to college debt by cutting Pell Grants, and how many people who need government help go to work every single day, but for poverty wages. And when pious words like shared sacrifice, making tough decisions, or reform are used, Regular people better hang on to their wallets. So here comes the good news part of my speech. There are solutions to all of these problems, and many of you are working on them right now. We can ask people who have more than they or their children or grandchildren can ever spend to pay a bit more to the common good, money that they won't hardly miss, money that won't dent their lifestyles, and I just happen to have bills that would do exactly that. So I have a Fairness in Taxation Act. Right now there's 7 brackets for paying your income taxes that end at $413,201 in taxable income. So that's 39.6% for the top bracket, whether you make that amount of money, or $413 million. So my bill says, let's update the tax code to take account of all these, huge CEO salaries, et cetera, and create 5 more brackets, but still keep the rate under what it was during most of the Reagan administration. And during that time, it was about 50%. During Eisenhower, something like 92%. So for $1 million taxable income, the rate would be 45%, ratchets up to 49% for $1 billion in taxable income. And capital gains and dividends would be taxed at those same rates, which raises about a cool $800 billion over the next decade. And you'd be surprised, more than you think, I have some support from millionaires. Senator Bernie Sanders and I introduced the Stop Corporate Tax Dodging Act to stop profitable corporations from sheltering income in places like the Cayman Islands and other tax havens. And it ends tax breaks for companies that encourage them to ship jobs overseas. Profits would be taxed wherever they are earned by American companies, and that bill would raise about $500 billion in additional revenue. I'm just full of good ideas like this. Social Security would be solvent into the next century if we just lifted the cap on income for which one has to pay into the trust fund. So, instead of stopping payment at $113,000, and by the way, our governor actually is done paying into Social Security for the year in less than 5 hours. He makes $25,000 an hour if you divide it all out. So he would have to pay FICA again, say, after his income exceeds, either $113,000, but we could also say $200,000 or $250,000. We could set a level. We have to pay more into Social Security where we would not only have enough money to protect it, but we would have enough money to strengthen it, to actually make it better. Because retirees are increasingly depending on all or nearly all of their income coming from Social Security. And you know what the average check is in this country? $13,000 a month. Less for women, always less for women. Pardon me? Oh, no, $1,300, I'm sorry, $1,300. Oh, $1,300, not $13,000. It's barely $13,000 a year. So $1,300 a month, less for women. Senator Durbin and I have introduced a bill that rewards American companies that are paying good wages and benefits to their workers here at home, the Patriotic Employer Tax Credit Act, and it provides $1,200 in a tax credit per U.S. employee for companies that meet those benchmarks of good wages and good benefits and grow or maintain the workforce. So how can we afford to do that? By closing those corporate tax loopholes. So these are the kinds of reforms and hard choices and shared sacrifice that make a lot of sense to me. But my friends, here's the best news of all. And that is the reason that I keep smiling. The most common question I get at home is, how can you stand it? Why is this woman smiling? Because the reason is that the American people are actually with us if we can communicate and reach everybody properly. More than 80% of Americans believe we should raise revenue for needed investments by closing corporate tax loopholes and outsourcing incentives and limiting deductions for the wealthiest. More than 60% of voters want to end the lower tax rate for capital gains and dividends so that actual work is not taxed as a higher rate than investments. More than 80% of Americans want us to increase taxes on the profits that American corporations make overseas. And almost 70% of voters believe that we should end tax breaks to large corporations that ship jobs overseas and use that money to invest in jobs in America. And also, much to the surprise of some of my colleagues, there are really important things happening outside the Congress right now. Hard for them to believe. But I have participated in the fight for 15 for minimum wage workers who are striking for $15 an hour and a union, the right to have a union. And I come from a union background myself, personally. I've been out on the street several times in Chicago and Washington and in New York. And good union jobs that afforded those South Side steelworkers a decent middle class and a secure retirement do not have to be relics of the past. This could be the picture of the United States of America today. And immigration. Immigrants have inspired a new fighting spirit, a huge coalition, including most of the business community, many of you have been part of it, RAC has been part of it, supports comprehensive immigration reform. And it will happen. It will happen. There are certain things that have a stamp of inevitability on them, and immigration reform is one of them. And I was out in front of the Supreme Court earlier today, where the Supreme Court is hearing oral arguments on marriage equality. Stamp of inevitability. Stamp of inevitability. And just like my grandparents helped to revitalize the American economy, every generation of immigrants does that, and we should welcome them. So I'm actually feeling really optimistic about the future. I'm feeling optimistic about the 2016 elections. I think that so many Americans who are struggling are really tired of being used as cannon fodder by the richest and most self-interested gazillionaires and corporate interests. The problem, as Hillary Clinton puts it, is that the deck is stacked against them, and that idea resonates with ordinary people who, in fact, know that the deck is stacked against them. So the answer to why is this woman smiling is simple. That change is on the way, and not a minute too soon, I believe, for everybody in this room. Thank you very much.